Good morning, and welcome to this online service from the Unitarian Universalist Church of Meadville, Pennsylvania, a beacon for free thinkers, and I might add, a thorn in the side of religious orthodoxy since 1825. We're very happy that you're joining us. We would love to be all together in the sanctuary, and hopefully we will be again when it becomes safe to do so. But in the meantime, I'm very glad to be here and to be with you. My name is Josh Searle White. I've been a member of this church since, I almost said 1825. No, since 1995. And I've served in a variety of positions over that time. Today's music was presented by Ron Mummy and Jennifer Hellworth and myself, and you'll hear, as you just did, that we've tried to preserve the sense of live performance by just doing one take and not editing it. So hopefully you have enjoyed that. We have a couple of songs that we're going to play during the service also. And the intention of the service today is for us all to be able to take some time to breathe and to remember that we are part of a much larger community, religious liberals, human beings that goes far beyond our town and our congregation and our denomination and our country. We're joining together on a Sunday morning to remember that there are parts of our existence that are much bigger and much more important and much more fundamental to our lives as human beings than any of the traditional affiliations that we give ourselves. So sit back or lie back or relax and join us for this worship service this morning. Our opening words today are from the poet Audre Lorde. It's her poem entitled Coping. It has rained for 5 days running. The world is a round puddle of sunless water where small islands are only beginning to cope. A young boy in my garden is bailing out water from his flower patch. When I ask him why, he tells me, young seeds that have not seen sun forget and drown easily. We're now going to light our chalice. The flaming chalice or the flaming candle is a symbol in many religious traditions for the search for truth and for the path to follow. And so if you have a candle nearby or a virtual candle or a flashlight or anything that you'd like to light safely to join with us, please repeat with me the words that you'll see on your screen from the Passover Haggadah. May the light we now kindle inspire us to use our powers to heal and not to harm, to help and not to hinder, to bless and not to curse, to serve you, Spirit of life.
Unison affirmation of covenant and mission. Our covenant is to be a loving, joyful community that nurtures spiritual growth, promotes compassion, social responsibility, and service in an atmosphere of mutual trust. Our mission is to be a faith community devoted to love and respect, reason, and justice.
Now's the time we consider generosity and offering our gifts to the church and its work. Typically in a live church service, of course, we'd send around some ushers and you would put money in a basket. And as you know, we give half of our non-pledge contributions to a worthy cause or a worthy organization in the community. Today, we can't do that. I wouldn't really recommend you just opening up your window and handing money to the first person who comes by, though you might try that and see what it feels like. But if you're feeling of a mind and of a heart to be generous, please go to the church's website and pay on your pledge and also offer any additional funds that you might want to offer for the work of this church and the work of our community. As you know, this is a time when we all need to pull together, and so those of us with resources have an opportunity to do something financially that will strengthen and strengthen our community and help us all move forward together. So thank you for your generosity. They say everything can be replaced. They say every distance is not near. So I remember every face and every man who put me here. I see my light come shining from the west down to the east. Any day now, I shall be released. They say every man needs protection. They say that every man must fall. Yet I swear I see my reflection. Somewhere so high above this wall, I see my light come shining from the west down to the east. Any day now, I shall be released. Yonder stands the man in this lonely crowd, a man who swears he's not to blame. All day long I hear him shouting so loud, crying out that he's betrayed. I see my light come shining from the west down to the east. Any day now, I shall be released. Any day now, I shall be released. I want to talk about my garden. I'm looking at it right now, actually through my window here in my office, and it's covered with a dusting of snow, and otherwise it is made almost entirely of mud. And because I've actually been locked down for 6 weeks now or so, like most of you, I did manage to send off for some seeds, which I often forget to do, but this time I did, and I'm actually ready to plant stuff. And I really want to get out there, and I want to plant stuff, and I want to see it grow, and the problem is that I just can't. Because as you know, if you've been a gardener in our area, if you go out and try to plant stuff too early, it's not going to work. First, even though we've had a few nice days, this is in April still, we still have a lot of cold coming, we could have snow, and a lot of young seedlings can't tolerate that kind of situation. And as Audre Lorde said in our opening poem, seeds that don't see any sun forget, and they drown. I'm sure she had other metaphorical meanings for that line, but literally it's also true. You just can't put some seeds in the ground this early in the year. But it's not just that. It's not just if I put stuff in the ground now, it would likely die. It's also the case that if I go walking around in the garden right now and try to dig it up and turn it over and plant stuff, what's going to happen is I'm going to end up packing the soil down so that even later in the spring, when it is time to plant, nothing will grow there because the soil will all be packed down into one solid mass. So it's not just that it's unproductive for me to go out in the garden right now. It's actually counterproductive. But that doesn't stop me from staring. I go out there and I stare and I say, oh man, maybe today is the day to do it. Maybe I get a little bit of sun. Maybe now I can go out. Maybe now. And, of course, I know full well I can't. And so I end up agitated because I just feel frustrated by the situation. Now, what is the point? Why am I telling you about all this? Well, I wish I could tell you that really my desire to plant the garden is that I'm filled with this longing to see the miracle of nature and the wonder of plants springing from seeds. But it's not about that. I do actually appreciate those things, and I do think they're real. But in this particular case, at this moment, my desire to go plant in the garden has nothing to do with the miracle of life and everything to do with the fact that I am having a hard time coping. I don't have to tell you about the many ways that things are difficult right now, reading the news and seeing all the suffering and then the false knowing and the recklessness and the desperation and all the stuff, all of that. Even if you have the most perfect situation, which I practically do, I'm retired, I have a house to live in, food to eat, I have woods nearby because we live in Meadville, so I can go walking. Even if you have that situation, it's still stressful. And then if you're in a city and you're cramped inside an apartment, that's stressful. And if you have to go out and work because you're in an essential profession and face the virus and people who may or may not be following the guidelines, that's stressful. And you have to be home and try to work and have kids and take care of them. That's stressful. I recently saw a little posting online about somebody who said, is it possible to do remote online instruction while I'm homeschooling my kids? And then of course, that's assuming then you have a job. Then there are a lot of people who are out of work. It's just a horribly stressful time. Everybody knows that. So we've all got to find ways to cope. And it would be hard enough if it was just coping. It's a really scary situation out there. But there's also all of these voices that tell us that we have to cope the right way. We live in the land, of course, of hyper productivity. We've been taught that we need to maximize our time and maximize our productivity and multitask and not miss anything and do it all. I read this quote the other day in a Wired articles by a woman named Lori Penny, and she said this perfectly. She said productivity, or the lack of it, has become the individual metric of choice for coping with the international eco-pathological, I can't actually say this next word, but basically screw up of the corona crisis. She goes on, she says, productivity is not a synonym for health or for safety or for sanity. But as a precarious millennial who for the past 10 years has answered every cautious inquiry about my well-being with a rundown of how much work I got done that day, I do understand the confusion. And there is in our society, thanks to that Protestant work ethic that we were founded on with the Puritans, the sense that what you produce equals your worth. That if you can get things done, you're a good person. And if you can't get things done, then you're a bad person. And so that easily translates into all of these voices that say, you've got this time, you're unemployed or you're stuck at home. You should learn a language, you should get into shape. You should be cooking exotic food, Yeah, go ahead. And if you're home with your kids all the time, well, this is great. You get to have great family time, All of this voices that's telling us, putting pressure on top of pressure on top of pressure, that we ought to be maximizing this time. Now, some of this is not new. This is just our regular, what the spiritual teacher Robert Holden calls destination addiction. It's like, in addition to the Protestant work ethic, where our worth is measured by our productivity, we also have this idea that if we can just finish this project or get this job or finish our degree or get married or whatever it is, then we'll be happy. It's if we do this, when we do this, finally we will get there. And you even hear this in some spiritual traditions, this sort of destination addictions, like, oh, well, when you're enlightened, this happens. But if you've lived any number of years, I'm sure you know that this is just not true. Because when you finish all those things, you're still you. I mean, those of you who know me know that I like talking in front of groups of people. I find it very stressful, but I like to do it. And one time when I was working for the Unitarian Universalist Association, I got a chance to be the keynote speaker at this big weekend event in Sacramento, and I was in a hotel ballroom, and I was the keynote speaker, so there were no other things happening at the time, and all these people came, and there were like 350 people or something like that, and I was the star, and I gave the speech, and I was brilliant. At least I thought so. Anyway, and they gave me a big applause at the end, and I went back to my hotel room, and I was still the same schmo that I was before I started. Because I was not transformed into a rock star or anything because I had this successful event. No, I'm just me. So, by the way, actually, I think rock stars, actual rock stars, they're also just themselves too. And that's one of the things I actually appreciate about what's happening now with like these stars doing these broadcasts on YouTube and stuff like that, where you actually get to see them at home and you realize, oh yeah, they've got to go feed the kids too and do the laundry. And, because out on stage, they can pretend to be whoever they think they're pretending to be. But at home, you can kind of see, oh yeah, they're just people too. It's kind of humanizing in that way. But, I think it's really true. The deepest truth is that no amount of achievement, no amount of projects, no amount of deeds is ever going to help us feel kind of justified in the long term. Now, I'm not saying we shouldn't achieve things or do good deeds or fight for justice or bring home a paycheck or anything like that. These are, when these are good things to do, well, let's do them. Right? But what I'm saying is, I don't think we should expect these things, these actions, to give us a sense of self-worth in the long term. Short term, sure. Jennifer and I took some time during one of our rare sunny days recently and put up a fence around what will be the garden. I felt great about that because it takes me a long time to do stuff like that. I haven't raked the leaves that are sitting in the backyard and have been there since October. And maybe I will feel good when I do those, if I do those. But short term, okay, you can feel good from get a sense of satisfaction of doing a good deed or something that needs to be done. But it doesn't get at that sort of gnawing sense of unworthiness or lack of self-worth that really I think is part of the human condition, and that's exacerbated when you're in a crisis situation like this. And if you have any time at all to be looking at yourself and spending time with yourself, you find out that it's very uncomfortable, which is why I think that so many of us overwork so much. I mean, yes, there are real demands from the real world, and there are real people who tell us we need to do things. But I also think that we spend, a lot of us anyway, I know I did, spend a lot of time working because that way we can just feel a sense of satisfaction. If I put in the hours, then okay, I'm okay. And I also don't have to look at my own inner being. Because that's really what we're talking about here. What we're talking about is how do we find that inner sense of justification, that inner sense of worth and dignity that our first principle talks about. How do we experience that, not just assert that, not just say it, not just affirm it, but really live it? There's only one way, I think. Only one thing that is going to give us long-term salvation in that broadest sense. And that is, wait for it, I'm about to reveal the secret teaching that underlies all spiritual traditions from time immemorial. Are you ready for it? Here it goes. It's not a secret. The teaching that underlies all spiritual wisdom that I know about anyway is that the only way to be fully whole, the only way to kind of close that yawning gap between the limited and fragile and imperfect beings that we feel ourselves to be and the potential that we know is possible is to kind of open up and accept that against all appearances and against all of our doubts, we are actually, each of us, an inextricable and valuable part of the greater whole. I mean, we just are. I mean, there's one spiritual tradition I really love that says it this way. It says, God speaks through you as you. So it's not that we are bestowed with salvation by some greater being or by some force outside ourselves. It is that we ourselves are a manifestation of the great wonder of the universe, just as we came from the earth and will eventually go back to it. We are constituted of the same materials, the materials that constitute that tree that I'm looking at, and that house across the road, and the basketball hoop, and the grass. We come from that. We are a part of that. We're already a part of the great wonder of the universe, and that's why we have, as an inherent part of our physical, psychological, and spiritual makeup, that absolute worth and dignity that every other part of the whole also has. Now, of course, I don't know how you're taking this in because I can't see you. You know, you could be experiencing this like, the greatest of spiritual insights, or just more New Age mumbo jumbo. And, I can't really tell you how that insight plays for you or whether it even works for you at all. But my experience is that unless you're one of the very few lucky ones who's had this spiritual conversion where this kind of sense of insight or sense of grace simply descends upon you and transforms you forever, well, you actually have to work at it. I mean, that's what spiritual practices are about. Actually, I suspect that the people who have had a conversion experience or a sense of God's grace in the Christian tradition descend upon them, that they still have to work at it too. I remember once I read this essay by Jack Kornfield. He's a Buddhist teacher, and he talks about going off to this meditation retreat and all of the great things that happen, the connection and the ecstasy of all of that stuff. And then he comes back, and of course, that's a weekend workshop. Then he comes back, and he's got to go to therapy on Monday to deal with his personal issues, and that's just normal. The book this comes from is called After the Ecstasy, The Laundry. I mean, what a brilliant title. Because that's part of the paradox, is that we really are flawed and limited and fragile, and we also are a manifestation of this greater whole. At the same time, it's kind of bizarre, but it's true, at least as far as I understand. And the other paradox, of course, and I think one reason why spirituality is so elusive and why there's so much room for spiritual teachers to kind of keep telling us the same thing over and over again, is because there is this paradox that on the one hand, there's absolutely nothing we have to do to justify our existence or prove ourselves worthy. And yet, on the other hand, you can't just kind of sit around and wait to have that feeling. You actually have to work at it. You have to do something. And there's lots of different ways to do this. I mean, people are very different. Religious traditions and cultures are different. Like in the yogic tradition in India and in Tibet and places like that, they identify different paths towards establishing that wholeness. There's the path of knowledge, There's the path of action, karma, where you do deeds that then help you understand the interconnectedness. There's the path of devotion, where you open yourself up to devotional practices. So there's all kinds of ways of doing this, but for me, there is a core, and in that core is that all of those various practices involve engaging in some form of relationship with that which is beyond us. So in Eastern traditions, if you do meditation or yoga or something like that, you don't do these so that your low back doesn't hurt, though that's why I got into yoga. And you don't do them so that your concentration and focus are better. These things might happen, but the reason you do these things ultimately, at least in those traditions, is to clear the mind so that you can actually see what's really there. You can really experience the connection and the oneness of all things, rather than only be reacting to your thoughts all the time. And here's another one, a spiritual practice that I'm doing right now that I find really useful as I'm kind of struggling with coping. I have a teacher named Betty Martin who talks about learning to distinguish in our experience between pushes and pulls. Okay, so a push is when we feel the need to do something because we should. We got to be productive, we got to be moral, we got to look good to others. A pull is when we're drawn to something because we are feeling a connection to it. So, for example, let's go back to the garden. When I look at my garden and I agitate because I think I should get out there and get things planted so that I can find some way of justifying my existence, that's a push. When I find myself drawn to the garden because I'm fascinated by the mystery of the plants coming out of seeds, like I talked about before, it's a miracle. I have no idea how that happens, but it does. It's amazing. Or maybe because I just love the feeling of dirt beneath my hands, or because I just feel more whole when I'm, on all fours in the garden. Well, that's a pull. So pushes result in anxiety and tension and agitation. Pulls have an experience of longing, connection, and fulfillment. So the spiritual practice, is to pay attention to my own motivations. Am I doing something out of a push, which is essentially isolating, or something out of a pull, something which is essentially connecting? And the more that we orient ourselves around the pulls, the more we orient ourselves around connection and love and longing and reaching out. So for me, it's a great spiritual practice. And that's what we need. For me anyway, and maybe for you too, in this time of crisis, is ways to cope that help us remain connected, that help us stay sort of spiritually alive when everything's so difficult. And it doesn't need to be something esoteric, it doesn't need to be something imported from another culture. It really just needs to be an internal process of orienting ourselves towards those things that help us feel connected. And I guess I would just add this, that it's a time also for giving ourselves some slack. And everybody else too, I mean, we're all going to do some crazy things, in our kind of desperation to deal with the stress, We're going to experiment. I've been playing Frisbee. That really works for me. It's a good socially distant activity, especially because the way we throw the Frisbee, you end up running very far away from your other person that you're playing with. I've been experimenting. I've been going to dance parties by video conference, of course, There's one every day at noon that Jennifer introduced me to, where it's a family in London and a couple of teenagers and the parents, and they put on music and they dance, and they offer it to anybody else who wants to come dance with them. I even went to a clothing optional dance party on the internet. I'm just going to let that image settle in your mind for a bit there. Anyway, it's just experimentation. I mean, we all don't know what's going to work for us right now. It's not the time for judgment and condemnation. This is the time for compassion, giving people a break. Now, it's true. Some people are going to be out there and they're going to be trying to use this crisis for their own gain or to push their own political agendas. You know who you are if you're listening. But most of us, we're just trying to find a way to get through the day. I remember a few years ago, the department administrator in my department had a sign on her desk that said, "If I didn't hit, scratch, or bite anyone, it was a good day." I think that's where the bar should be right now. Let's a low bar that emphasizes non-harming. And I think that's the biggest and most important paradox of all of this. And if there's one thing a crisis tends to do, it tends to try to get us to circle the wagons, to think of ourselves and our families and wall off and hole up and separate ourselves out from others and treat everybody as the enemy, especially in a time where we're dealing with a pandemic, so that everybody seems an infectious invader to us. But I suspect, that if we sit still long enough and listen deeply enough to what's inside us, that what we find there, in addition to the fear and the desire to wall off, is also a pull to open up and to connect and to experience the oneness, including the pain that all of humanity is going through right now. And I think that sitting in that realization, in that experience of shared reality, of in all of its joys and in all of its sorrows, well, I can't really imagine anything more human than that. So may it be for all of us wonderful, limited, flawed, and beautiful instantiations of the universal. Amen. Please join me in the words of extinguishing our chalice, or our flame, or our flashlight, whichever we have with us. We extinguish this flame, but not the light of truth, the warmth of community, or the fire of commitment. These we carry in our hearts until we are together again. Instead of closing words today, we have a musical benediction sung by Alanis Morissette called You Learn. And the idea here is that what's important is not necessarily our experience, but our relationship to it. As she points out in the song, you can learn from just about anything if your relationship to it is one of openness and connection. May your week and your month and your life be full of openness and connection too. Amen.
You learn.